Welcome to our introductory podcast on human physiology. Now, when we study physiology, of course, this is going to be related to the body. But we have anatomy, we have cell biology, we have kinesiology, the movement. What we're talking about specifically with physiology is going to be the mechanisms by which the human body works. Now, when we break down the word, the Greek root of physiology is physis, which means the nature or origin, and logos or ology is speech. So really the literal translation of physiology is the language of nature. How the different systems of the body, the different cells, the different tissues are communicating with each other to cause this great creation, our human body, to function optimally. Now, one of the great sources of information of our day that a lot of people don't necessarily put a lot of credibility in, but Wikipedia. It's usually one of the first places I go to look for information. And this is really a very small synopsis of what we mean with physiology. So physiology is the study of the mechanical, physical, and biochemical functions of living organisms. And for our purposes this semester, that organism is going to be the human body. Now, we are going to be talking about a lot of different systems, practically every system in the human body. We'll touch on some and spend a lot greater time and detail on others. But when you look at the complexity of the human body, understand that all systems, whether we're endocrine, mucoskeletal, respiratory, integumentary, all of these are functioning together within this one unit that we call the body, and none is mutually exclusive. They're all working together, not independent. So one is going to be reflected by the other. The other is going to be reactionary to the other. So we have to put all these together into this one centralized focus that we have called physiology. Now, this interrelated nature of all of these different systems working together, and again, I mentioned to the optimal working conditions of the body. This is absolutely critical because, again, instead of just systems, when you look at the different organs and cell types, we have red blood cells, a component of our blood. We have skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, our digestive system, urinary system. Here's the skeleton, reproductive system, circulatory system. We have the nervous system. We have our sensory receptors. All of these are working together. And when we focus on the optimal condition of the human body and the symmetry of the human body, we basically are brought to the point that we have to ask, what is the ultimate goal of physiology? And that ultimate goal of physiology is called homeostasis. Now, homeostasis is essentially going to be balance. And when we look at the balance of any one particular criteria for the human body, there are going to be a lot of things that impact it and a lot of things that are going to respond to it. So let's just take water. We're mostly water. We consume water. We excrete water. And so whether we lose water through evaporation and sweat, transpiration from our breathing, which you can see on a very cold morning, or the water loss in our solid waste, or certainly the volume of fluid that we lose in our liquid waste, our output per day is about 2.5 liters that we lose. So we've got to bring it in. Now, we drink quite a bit, or should be, and this is largely where we lead to dehydration. But we also obtain a little bit of water in the food that we eat, and our body produces a little bit of water through metabolic activities. So this balancing act, this homeostatic balance, that is the ultimate goal of physiology. Now, homeostasis, again, when we break this word down, homos equal, stasis means to stand. So really, Walter Bradford Cannon coined this term, and it literally means to stand equally. And if you've ever seen someone do yoga and standing on one leg, you know, the people that do it really well, not like me, they're not moving. There doesn't appear to be any activity going on. But if you've ever done yoga and you have to hold some of these poses, you realize your muscles are working like crazy. They're working overtime. And all of those muscles are working together to cause you to stand still, to stand in that one position, to stand equally. That term balance is a great term that helps me to understand really what's going on with homeostasis. Now, how does our body understand how to maintain a balance? And even when we go back to our yoga stance, for instance, we're going to have sensory information coming in. We have our inner ear is going to be affecting our balance. We have sensory receptors in our muscle that are going to be telling us the contraction state of our muscle. Our brain is going to respond to all of this information, and it's going to rapidly be sending signals out to those muscles to help us shift our body weight, to help us contract or to relax certain muscles, to keep us in this balance, to keep us still. So when we look at this information coming in, information going out to affect this optimal state, we can really think of homeostasis as dynamic constancy. Now, that may be an oxymoron. How can you be dynamic and be constant? How can you be active and standing still? Well, again, think of that yoga stance. Your body is working overtime, constantly working, but it looks as if you are in perfect balance and perfect harmony. The systems of your body are working constantly to maintain your body temperature, to maintain your fluid level, to maintain your blood pressure. All of these different criteria are affected by each other and have to be reacted upon by different systems to maintain that proper balance. Now, homeostasis, this term, this really came into being about 1865 when it was published by Claude Bernard, who really understood physiology, and he really understood how everything works together to afford this balance. And this balance is critical because many of you are going into the health professions, and when you're dealing with patients, understand that you're not just dealing with a disease, you're not just dealing with a condition, but you're trying to help this patient to be healthy. So what does it mean to be healthy? And this is the point that I really want to get across, because I think our society has a whole different idea of what healthy is these days. And according to the American Medical Association Alliance, to be healthy is to be in the optimal state of physical, mental, and social well-being. It's not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. So as you look around the room, or as you look around your family, or you look around your place of work, you see a lot of individuals that aren't healthy. But you as a health provider, you always have to remember you're dealing with a patient, a person, a human being. This is someone's son, someone's daughter, someone's husband, wife, father, mother. These are people. And you have an obligation as a health provider to, number one, be a good example to them, but help them attain this optimal homeostatic balance in their body so that they can say, I am healthy. To coordinate all of these systems and functions of the body, we really have two critical control centers. And the first you can probably guess right off the top of your head. So we're starting with the second one that you probably don't consider as readily, and that being the endocrine system. Now, this is an indirect connection as compared to the nervous system, which is, of course, the second control center, because hormones are going to be secreted, flow through the body, and must be detected and interpreted by different tissues to regulate functions such as reproduction, metabolism, plasma lymph composition, urine output, digestion. Almost every functional aspect of the human body can be controlled in some way, shape, and form by a hormone produced by an endocrine gland. Now, the nervous system, our second control center, this is the one we're more familiar with, the direct hardwired connection. This is going to be the brain and the spinal cord and our peripheral nervous system. It's going to be everything else. But I want to point out, too, that it's much more than causing muscles to move. It's much more than causing receptors to transmit information. There's a field of neurobiology that's called psychoneuroimmunology. And in this case, this is showing that there is basically a physiological consequence to the emotional state of the body. And you can see this so clearly when you look at elderly individuals who've been married for 50, 60 years. When one spouse dies, typically what's going to happen to the other spouse? Most of you have probably known this situation, that one spouse passes away, and in a very short amount of time, the other spouse passes away as well. They become depressed. They lose the will to live, and they basically will themselves to die. Their emotional state shuts down the physiology of the body. So the emotional aspect, and again, this relates to you being a health professional. It's critical that you take care of the emotional state of the patient as well as that physiological condition. You're not going to be seeing individuals in your clinics, in your hospitals, in your practices that are healthy. You're going to be seeing those that are struggling with something and looking to you to help them attain that optimal health. Now, with these two control centers, we see that we're going to be able to make a difference at the tissue level in one of two ways. And certainly with the nervous system, we can expect this extrinsic type of regulation, a regulation from a distance. And so either a hormone produced by the pituitary or the thyroid or stimulations from the brain, these can affect your body functions. And in this illustration, we're looking at blood pressure. See, here's our homeostatic balance, our 120/80 blood pressure. That's fairly textbook. But in some instances, we may see that our blood pressure rises. Now, as that does, we have receptors that can detect that. We're going to stimulate the nervous system, and that's going to lead to various responses. Our heart rate is going to decline. Our blood vessels are going to open up, and both of these are going to cause our blood pressure to drop, and that's going to return our blood pressure to the normal range. Likewise, if we see that we have low blood pressure, we're going to signal the brain. This is going to cause our blood vessel to constrict, to increase pressure. The rate and the force of our cardiac output is going to increase. The result is we're going to increase our blood pressure back to homeostatic balance. But both of these are going to be regulated by our central nervous system. Now, we do have some instances where we have built-in regulation. The organs can regulate themselves, and blood vessels have a very good way of doing this. Around many of our blood vessels, we have bands of smooth muscle. And we'll be talking in much more detail about this. But as these vessels detect higher than normal pressures in response to pushing outward on the smooth muscle, they will automatically and intrinsically constrict so that the blood pressure on the downstream side of this junction will be lower and be at homeostatic levels, while this might be too high. And so we'll see a lot of intrinsic activity as we go through our physiological systems and look at how the body regulates everything and keeps everything in balance. Now, in the illustrations we've already seen, we have to bring in information about what's going on with the body. We have to coordinate that information and plan a response. So when we look at basically a functional unit of homeostasis, it's going to be comprised of receptors, an integrating center, and the effectors. So our sensors, as we saw in a previous example, these are going to be our baroreceptors that detect blood pressure. That goes to our integrating center in the brain, and the brain responds by causing the smooth muscles of the blood vessels to either dilate or constrict, and it causes the cardiac muscles of the heart to either contract harder and faster or slower and less strong. That's going to be how we can regulate many of these activities. Now, we can see these in a very clear example because you don't have to think about these things happening in the body. These are subconscious. And when we think of reflexes, I know the first one that comes to mind is our standard knee-jerk reflex, where you tap the patellar tendon. It simulates a load being placed on the body, and it causes the quadriceps muscle to reflexively contract. And that will cause the leg to jerk, especially if you have weight taken off of the leg. So the knee-jerk reflex is a typical example of a homeostatic unit between the receptors bringing in information, the integrating center, and in this case it's the spinal cord. We don't even need the brain itself to tell us what to do. And we have a hardwired reflex connection back to the muscle. That's a very simple example. Let's make it a little bit more complicated. Body temperature, for instance. Now, our body temperature is constantly working. You know that dynamic constancy we talked about with homeostasis? Your body is constantly working to regulate that body temperature. Now, when you think of normal body temperature, well, we think of 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit or 37 degrees centigrade. But is there a range? If you have 98.9, does that mean you're sick? If you have 97.9, is something wrong? And when you look at the normal range of body temperatures, you may not be aware of this, but you have a diurnal phase of your body temperature. So that when you awake in the morning after a nice long sleep, and I know this says 7 a.m., I have 4 teenagers, so waking for them is not until we get to about 10 or 12. And with summer coming on and summer here, yeah, that's what that's going to be. But when you first wake, your body temperature is fairly low. Your body has not been active. Metabolism creates heat. And so as you get more active throughout the day, your body temperature rises. Here we are in the 99 degrees. But then as you get toward the restful periods and less metabolism, your body temperature begins to decrease. So here you can see the high and the low of your body regulating itself when it's active and when it's inactive. That's just one example of how your body does that. Now, these fluctuations up and down, it's going to be similar to what we saw with the seesaw diagram with blood pressure. And the way your body's going to do this with receptors coming in and information going out, we are going to want to maintain that dynamic constancy, that homeostasis. So we're going to do it in one of two ways, with feedback loops. So one feedback loop is going to be a negative feedback loop, and this is going to maintain an equilibrium, versus a positive feedback loop, which, think of this as a chain reaction. This is going to be a very unstable condition. So you will rarely see positive feedback loops in physiology. I would say 99% of our feedback loops we're going to be talking about in this course and in human physiology are going to be of the negative type to maintain that dynamic constancy. So let's look at these a little bit more closely. Negative feedback. So with negative feedback, I like to think of it almost like your thermostat at home. And in this case, when you bring in information, the output is going to be just the opposite. Here it says it's inverted. So think of your home. Okay, we're coming up to summer, and so we are going to be looking at that thermostat. We're going to have it set at what? Where do you set your thermostat? Mine's set around 73. I had some college students that had theirs set at 65. I can't pay those bills. But if we set our thermostat at 72, 73 degrees, when the air that is detected by that thermostat registers 74, 75, then we've got heat coming into that thermostat. The thermostat is going to respond by turning on the air conditioner, and the air conditioner coming on is going to cool the house. And now the temperature on the thermostat is going to drop. And when it reaches that set point, 72, 73, the cool air is going to turn off because now the air is cool. So that goes off. But invariably, if you watch a thermostat, it's going to bounce back and forth. It's going to get a little bit lower than 72 by the time after it's turned off. It's going to lower a little bit. And then it's going to get a little bit warmer before it finishes running. And so you're going to oscillate back and forth, much like our body temperature oscillated back and forth around the set point of 98.6. So how's your body doing this? Well, partially when we look at your body on a hot day as summer's approaching. So our sensors in our body, our receptors, are going to detect that your body temperature is getting too high. And your brain is going to respond and say, you know what, we need to lower our body temperature. 105 degrees is when brain cells start to die. And so we like to maintain that 98.6 and the fluctuations around very narrow limits. And so when your brain detects this, it's going to cause sweat to be produced. Now recall, sweat and the evaporation of the liquid from your skin cools the body. It dissipates the heat. So your body temperature lowers. Well, that's well and good. However, this is not an isolated unit. This is not an isolated activity in the body. Because since you've been sweating, guess what? You're losing fluids. So your body now detects that you have a decreased fluid volume because you've been sweating so much. You haven't been drinking enough water. And so the concentration of sodium in your blood is going up. So now the hypothalamus of the brain says, guess what? We are losing too much water. And the hypothalamus is going to signal our master endocrine regulatory gland, the pituitary, and it's going to release a hormone, in this case, anti-diuretic hormone. ADH is going to travel through the blood. It's going to be detected by receptors in the kidneys. And in the kidneys, that's where we're going to get an instruction to retain more water, to produce less urine. So we've lowered our body temperature, but now we're going to retain more fluid to keep our blood volume at a certain state. Now, also in this entire process, our brain's going to signal us that we're thirsty, and hopefully we will take a drink. But hopefully you're getting an appreciation now of the systems and the interrelated nature of how they function together. And we'll be going through all of these as we get to the regulation of blood pressure, the regulation of blood volume, the regulation of urine production as we go through the semester. We're just touching some of the highlights here and giving you some examples. Now, another way that we can regulate certain criteria of the body, and even around more narrow limits, is to have antagonistic forces working at the same time. Just like if you had your AC in your furnace running, if it got too cold, the furnace would kick on. If it got too hot, the AC would kick on. And that would decrease the range with which you could fluctuate. And sometimes it seems like, well, if they're working against each other, how do you get anything done? Well, antagonistically, when you look at your muscles, your biceps and your triceps have antagonistic actions on your forearm, but the state in which they are contracted or relaxed dictate the position of your forearm in space. So they're antagonistic, but they work together to very accurately position your forearm. Well, glucose is critical for body function. These carbohydrates are essential for the production of energy in the form of ATP in the body. And so glucose levels are detected and controlled by cells of the pancreas. Now, B cells in the pancreas, they're going to respond to high blood glucose, such as right after you eat a meal, and they're going to secrete insulin, and insulin is going to cause cells to uptake glucose and store it as glycogen, either in the liver or muscles or in your adipose tissue. And in that way, they're going to try to regulate that blood glucose level within very narrow limits. Now, we also have antagonistic cells that are going to help regulate that blood sugar when your blood sugar level drops. And to help you get a better appreciation for this antagonistic homeostatic regulation of carbohydrate level, let's watch this video.
Fluctuations in the internal and external environments are constant for living organisms. The body responds to these fluctuations by a process called homeostasis, the process of maintaining a relatively stable internal environment. We will look at fluctuations in blood glucose levels as an example of homeostasis. You are studying for a biology exam, about to review the chapter on cellular respiration, and decide you need a little extra energy. You consume an entire 32-ounce bottle of soda, approximately 1 liter. Your mid-study snack contained 100 grams of sugar and 400 calories. At first, you might have a burst of energy, but 30 minutes later, you begin to feel lightheaded and can't seem to keep your eyes open or your mind from wandering. What happened? To understand this unexpected result, we'll explore how your metabolism can get out of balance and how your body works to bring it back to normal. The cells of your body are fueled by glucose molecules that travel throughout your body in the bloodstream. Because glucose is so important, your body responds to fluctuations in blood glucose levels to maintain stable levels through homeostasis. After consuming food, the mouth and stomach begin the process of mechanical and chemical digestion. The partially digested food moves from the stomach to the small intestine, where larger molecules are further broken down. Smaller molecules, like the monosaccharides, glucose and fructose, are absorbed by the cells lining the intestine. Glucose passes out of the cells and into the interstitial fluid, then into the bloodstream. Once individual glucose molecules move into your bloodstream, your blood glucose level rises rapidly. The high sugar content of the soda causes a spike in blood glucose, triggering a hyperglycemic condition. The pancreas detects an increase in glucose levels in the bloodstream. In response, the beta cells of the pancreatic islets produce and secrete the hormone insulin into the bloodstream. Insulin binds to cell surface receptors and stimulates the transport of glucose into the cells of the body. Because of this rapid increase of insulin in response to the large amount of glucose from the soda, too much glucose is removed from the blood and stored as glycogen inside liver and muscle cells. As a result, your blood is now glucose deficient, a hypoglycemic condition. This low blood glucose level can cause lightheadedness, fatigue, and hunger. In response to glucose-deficient blood, the alpha cells of the pancreatic islets will produce and secrete the hormone glucagon. Once glucagon levels rise in the bloodstream, glucagon will diffuse out of the blood and bind to cell surface receptors in the liver, triggering the conversion of glycogen to glucose in liver cells. The stored glucose is released back into the bloodstream until homeostasis has been achieved. Turn back the clock. What would happen if you ate an apple, a handful of pistachios, or some popcorn instead of a liter of soda? The consumption of complex carbohydrates instead of simple sugars, like the ones found in the soda, results in a lower spike in blood glucose. Complex carbohydrates, like those found in healthier snacks, take longer to digest, so glucose is slower to enter the bloodstream. Homeostasis of blood glucose levels is more easily maintained because the drastic changes to glucose concentrations are diminished, without feelings of hunger or fatigue. The hunger experienced during bouts of low blood sugar, in addition to disrupting short-term homeostasis, can be a contributing factor to overeating and long-term problems like obesity. Glucose is also taken up by adipose cells during the spike in blood glucose and can be converted into fat. This, along with exaggerated portion size, sedentary lifestyles, and poor nutritional choices, are contributors to the worldwide obesity epidemic. By consuming more calories from natural sources containing complex carbohydrates, your body can maintain homeostasis of blood glucose levels more effectively. This can reduce your risk of gaining weight and improve your overall health. It can even help you keep focused while studying for that important biology exam.
In summary, we can see that high glucose levels, which is an imbalance of the homeostatic level of glucose, is offset by insulin being produced by the B cells, and therefore insulin causing glucose to be taken up into the cells of the body, and therefore lowering your blood glucose back to normal homeostatic levels. However, as the day progresses, when you undergo low blood glucose, as detected by the pancreas, alpha cells produce glucagon, which causes those cells, such as liver cells, that have stored glycogen, that's a storage form of glucose, it causes that to break down and release glucose back into the blood to increase blood glucose levels back to homeostatic limits. Now, we mentioned another type of feedback, that being positive feedback. As I mentioned, this is a chain reaction, and it really is an unstable situation. And fortunately, in biological systems, these are rare. But when we look at human population, And you think about this, the more people you have, the more babies you have, the more babies you have, the more people you have. So everything is moving in the same direction, the chain reaction. And you can see the prediction for the population growth that we see in the human population. Now, when we talk about internal physiology, there's really one positive feedback mechanism, and this is going to be related to half of the people listening, primarily females, because you're going to encounter this during the process of childbirth. So at the end of pregnancy, when labor begins, we're going to see that oxytocin is going to be released from the pituitary gland. Now, this release of oxytocin is coming from a hormone from the fetus itself. So the fetus actually signals when they're ready to be born. And so oxytocin is going to cause the uterus to contract. And these are going to be those beginning contractions. However, uterine contractions are going to cause oxytocin to be produced in increasing concentrations. So the more oxytocin you have, the stronger the contractions, the more frequent the contractions, which causes more oxytocin to be produced, until finally the end of this positive feedback chain reaction is delivery of the baby. And that is our positive feedback mechanism. Now, we're going to see that all of these work together. And principally, we've got more of the negative than anything, but these work together for that homeostatic balance. So we've seen it in the human population. We've seen it in the physiology of the body as it relates to temperature, as it relates to fluid volume, glucose levels. But we can also witness homeostasis at the cellular level. For instance, when you have a protein that is produced, maybe it's going to be in response to the binding of a ligand to its receptor. This is interleukin 2. Once this binding happens, you're going to have signal transduction that's going to change a number of molecules in the signaling pathway. It's going to cause the expression of new molecules. But what's going to happen is the more of this, in this particular illustration, SOX3, the more of this product that you produce, this is going to feed back in a negative manner, and it feeds back to the receptor itself to shut down the stimulation and the production of itself. So the more SOX3 you produce, the cell then is signaled to stop producing SOX3 to maintain a homeostatic level of SOX3 in response to interleukin 2. So here we have this protein product that's controlling the actual production of the product itself, the translation of that product. Now, in many instances, this is not going to be a direct cause and effect. We're going to have a series of enzymes. We're going to have a lot of intermediates, and you can see this in your whole second messenger signaling cascade. We can see this in the transcription and translation regulation in the cells of the body. So this is just an example of how at the molecular level, we can see this homeostatic balance. And it's actually critical because if you disrupt cellular homeostasis, you can have big problems. And one big problem is going to be in cell division. Now, you've already encountered mitosis, so we're not going to go through all those steps. But you know there are a number of places in interphase in which you come to these checkpoints between the growth phase and the synthesis phase, between the growth 2 phase and the mitotic phase. This is going to ensure that the cells are in the right state and they are supposed to be dividing at the right time. But this isn't always the case. But cells intrinsically can be able to regulate their own mitotic activity. And we're going to see how they do that. Let's do this experiment. We have cells that we have taken out and put into a tissue culture dish. And many of these adherent cells will attach and they will grow until they form a uniform layer on the bottom of the dish. We call this a confluent layer, meaning the cells are touching on all sides. There's really no more room for these cells to grow. And so guess what? Their cell division stops. There's no more growth. How do the cells know to stop growing? And have they lost the ability to divide? Well, it's a common little experiment. So you can take a little plastic spatula, which is very creatively called a cell scraper, and you can damage that layer. Now, You as a junior scientist, if you were to do this experiment, knowing that the cells had stopped dividing, what is your prediction going to be? Will cell division begin again? Will it remain halted? Or will only a certain subpopulation of cells begin to divide? Well, as we see, the cells do divide, and they fill in that space. However, not every cell in the dish underwent the cell division. Only the cells that were at the edge of the damaged site, only the cells that felt they had room to grow, actually began the process of cell division again. And so experiments like this help us to understand that cells intrinsically have a contact-dependent inhibition of growth. And that prevents our cells from overgrowing. Think of your skin. Your skin is confluent, it's intact until you have a cut, a damaged site, in which case the cells begin to divide again to fill in that gap. Now, we also know that cells communicate with one another through secreted signals, so extrinsic regulation. So hormones, chemicals, we call them chemokines or cytokines. These can also stimulate the activity of mitosis in cells, especially during wound healing. But all of these are processes of normal cells that have absolute control of their mitotic activity and cellular physiology. But that's not always the case, is it? No, there are times when we have mutations that occur inside the cell. Their regulatory mechanisms become flawed. And so what happens is the consequences of failed regulation, the consequences of a genetic mutation. And we're going to see this is the beginnings of what could potentially become cancer. So first, we have a mutation caused by a mistaken DNA, maybe from an external source, maybe from just replication of cells if you copied them a certain number of times. But if you have this mutation in the wrong gene, and therefore you have a faulty protein, you may lose your contact-dependent inhibition of growth. That may be completely gone. And in which case, cell replication is going to be out of control, resulting in overcrowding. The cells are just going to stack up on one another. So let's return to our experiment. Here we have cells that have been mutated. They have lost that ability to control their cell division. So are they going to remain as just a single sheet? No. They're going to begin to pile up on each other. They have lost that contact-dependent inhibition of growth. And at this point, as we look in the dish, or if this is happening in our body, what do we call this mass of cells? Now, ideally, we will call this a tumor. It's not yet cancer. Some of you may have said cancer. Now, we'll get there, but at this point, we simply have too many cells, and they're all together. So we can simply just call this a tumor, and we'll get to cancer in just a bit. So once you overcrowd the cells, then you run out of food. It's like having a population of animals in a confined area. If you don't have enough food, some are going to starve. And when some starve, they die. And cells are no different. When you have too many cells to sustain their growth because you don't have enough resources, you get necrosis or cell death. And so in the center of some very large tumors, you can see this necrotic activity. And here we have an experimental mouse that has a tumor, and the center of that tumor has become necrotic and begun to die. Simply, it cannot get the blood vessels into the center of this tissue. It has become necrotic, it can be gangrenous, and it can lead to the death of an individual. Now again, what we're looking at is tumor, but it could be cancer. We still don't have enough information to know that. So what's the difference between a tumor and a cancer? Well, let's follow the progression. We see that first we have to have a genetic mutation of a cell. Then this genetic mutation has to cause the cell to divide out of control, lose its contact-dependent inhibition of growth. That's called hyperplasia. Hyper as a prefix means above. Plasia means form or growth. So we just have too many cells. But then eventually the cells in the middle are going to change their form. They're going to look different. They're going to act different. And we call them dysplasia. Now, when we get to this last term, I don't particularly care for this all that much because it's almost like an oxymoron. In situ cancer. In situ means in place. But cancer as a term means that we have not stayed in one place, but that we have invaded throughout the body. Now, if you have a tumor that stays in one place, that's called a benign tumor. However, if you have a tumor that dysplastic cells have migrated away, we refer to this as a malignant tumor, or another name for that is cancer. Now, the cells that leave this tumor, they're called metastases, and the process by which they move, this invasive process, is referred to as metastasizing. And I think you can see in our illustration the problem. If these cells happen to get into a blood vessel or a lymphatic vessel, that's like a highway, a freeway, an interstate. They can go throughout the body, and that's when you have a lot of problems. If you have a tumor that's in place, the in situ cancer, basically you have cancer cells that have yet to leave that primary tumor. If you can surgically remove that tumor, including some of the normal tissue surrounding it, a pathologist is going to look at that and say, oh, you've got basal cell carcinoma, but the margins were clear. That basically means that tumor has been removed. You have just cured that person of cancer. However, if you have a tumor that is spread, metastasized, this is where the treatments such as chemotherapy and radiation therapy are having to attack cells that are dividing out of control, not just cancer cells, but all cells that are dividing rapidly. They will be affected as well, such as your hair, the lining of your intestinal tract, your immune system. We've all known people that have been on chemotherapy and radiation therapy, and it is a very debilitating treatment to go through to try to treat and cure a patient of cancer. Well, since genetic mutations are the cause of this, what causes the genetic mutations? Well, anytime you stress a cell, stress cells to the point that they have to divide more rapidly, that could lead to a mistake, and a mistake in the wrong place could lead to cancer. So acid reflux can lead to esophageal cancer. Cigarette smoke, this can lead to cancer of the mouth or in the lungs. And environmental agents are a cause of this thing. Benzopyrene, this is the carcinogenic agent that's present in cigarette smoke. It's just not the smoke and the debris. It's this actual chemical that's produced that causes damage to the cells, causes them to have to divide, possibly mutate, that can lead to lung cancer. Another problem, ionizing radiation. This is where I have to get on my soapbox. It's summertime. Everybody's laying out. Everybody's going to the tanning salon. You got to have that bronze look. Well, your body is basically trying to protect itself against the damage radiation. As your skin gets darker, that's your body's means of protecting the cells that are dividing that could become cancer. So the darker you are, the more damage you are doing to your skin. X-rays is another indication. And I don't know if any of you are more disturbed than me, but have you ever worried when you go to the dentist and they drape that lead apron over you and then the technician runs out of the room to turn on the X-ray machine? Just kind of gives me an uneasy feeling as they scamper out of the room. But this is really critical, and a little bit of advice. You are the boss of you. So if you have to have an X-ray on any part of your body, ask for a lead apron, especially to cover your pelvic region. And this applies to both men and women. You have eggs, ladies, and guys, you have sperm, spermatogonia, and these are your germ cells that could be the cell that fertilizes an egg that leads to a child. And you do not want to mutate that early germ cell, because then you can have some major, major problems. So just ask for the lead aprons, cover the pelvic region, and you'll be protected from that. Now, viruses are one that have been in the news for about the past 10 years or so, and especially the human papillomavirus, HPV, because HPV are thought, two types of HPV, are thought to cause 70% of all cervical cancers. Now, wouldn't it be great if we could just have a vaccine such as Gardasil that could guard against these different types of human papillomavirus? And shouldn't everyone be required to be vaccinated against HPV? Well, now you're getting into some ethical questions. And it sounds like a good thing, but people like choices. And as far as those choices that don't affect the whole population, that's up to some politicians and you and your children and your children's children. But in this case, it sounds like a very helpful vaccine that could really protect a lot of people. So viruses can cause cancer. Now, another big one is your genetics, your hereditary predisposition. And many of you have probably heard that if you have an immediate relative, a mother, a sister, an aunt that has had breast cancer, then you are at a greater risk of also having breast cancer. Again, this speaks to this hereditary predisposition. And really, one of the areas that they're looking at are specific genes and mutations of these genes, and the ones that have garnered the most attention are the breast cancer early onset genes 1 and 2. That's what BRCA1 and BRCA2 really stands for. Now, listen very carefully. BRCA1 and BRCA2 are normal genes that are in everyone's body. And these genes actually fight against cancer. They're called tumor suppressor genes. They actually go in and repair damaged DNA. However, women that have inherited a mutation in either or both BRCA1 and BRCA2, this is the individuals that have up to possibly an 80% greater chance of developing breast cancer in their lifetime. Now, should people be tested for BRCA1 and BRCA2 early on so that they'll know if they have a greater chance of it or not, so that they can seek different treatments, yes or no? Well, that would be great for you to know that information, but who would you not want to know that information? You would not want your insurance company to know that information because your premiums would go up. Insurance companies make money on healthy people. They lose money on the sick people. And while insurance companies have their great commercials that we're in the business to help you, they are in business to make money. That's their business. So this is the other ethical side of this whole question about this genetic testing. Who has access to that information, how it can be used for or against certain individuals? I think for our best interest, this would be something we would all want to know. Now, some females and some very public figures have found these mutations in their body, and they have gone ahead and elected to have radical bilateral mastectomies. Just thinking, if I've got that greater chance, I don't even want to go there. I don't want it to ever be a problem. That's a personal decision that I think individuals have to make. But this knowledge and this information could be part of that decision-making process. Now, lastly, this is just a diagram that shows your normal BRCA1 gene, and BRCA2 would be the same. If you have a mutation in a gene, BRCA1 can stitch it back together. But if you mutate this BRCA1 gene that's illustrated by this needle and thread, it's not present, it's not active, it's not functioning. It can't repair this particular gene. And in this case, this P10 gene that they've used as an example, now we're going to lose our ability to control cell division. We are going to sprout new vessels. We are going to form tumors that metastasize, and therefore a malignant tumor or cancer.